The internet is in a frenzy after a tense situation involving Tamar Braxton and Mendeecees Harris took a sharp turn. What fans are calling a heated confrontation quickly spiraled once Funky Dineva stepped in, claiming to have receipts that challenged the story circulating online. Clips, timelines, and statements began resurfacing, and suddenly social media was arguing over what really happened and what might be getting exaggerated. Supporters on both sides are locked in, each pointing to different moments as proof, while others warn that the situation is being blown out of proportion. One thing's clear: emotions ran high, narratives collided, and the internet is once again deciding a verdict before facts settle. The internet doesn't wait for clarity, it reacts to tension. And the moment names like Tamar Braxton and Mendeecees Harris were mentioned in the same breath, timelines exploded. Fans weren't asking if something happened, they were asking how bad it was. That's how fast narratives form. What began as talk of a heated exchange quickly escalated into rumors of something physical, claims that spread faster than any confirmation ever could. No official reports surfaced, no verified footage showed violence. But the language online grew more intense with every repost. And then Funky Dineva entered the conversation. Funky didn't claim to witness anything firsthand. Instead, he pointed to context, timelines, prior statements, and what he described as inconsistencies in how the story was being told online. Fans immediately latched onto that, framing it as exclusive proof, even though what was actually being discussed were receipts of conversation, not evidence of assault. That distinction got lost almost immediately. Social media doesn't slow down for nuance, it accelerates past it. Within hours, phrases like jumped and attacked were being used casually despite the lack of verified information. Reaction channels repeated the language. Comment sections escalated it further. And suddenly, a disputed confrontation had turned into a viral storyline of alleged violence. That's when the sides formed. Supporters of Tamar expressed outrage, saying the tone of the rumors reflected a pattern of women being disrespected and dismissed in public disputes. They pointed to her past experiences and argued that the way the story was being framed felt intentionally aggressive. Supporters of Mendeecees pushed back hard, saying the narrative was being exaggerated beyond recognition. They emphasized that no proof of physical harm existed and accused the internet of sensationalizing a disagreement for clicks. And somewhere in the middle sat Funky Dineva's commentary, dissected, clipped, and reposted in pieces that often removed his cautionary language. Because caution doesn't trend, certainty does. What Funky actually emphasized was sequence. Who said what first, how timelines were being rearranged, why certain claims didn't line up when placed side by side. His focus wasn't violence, it was credibility. But credibility debates don't stay tidy online. Fans took his analysis and ran with it, often stretching his words further than he did himself. Suddenly, receipts became proof and speculation became conviction. This is where the danger lies. When commentary morphs into accusation without verification, the story becomes less about truth and more about momentum. And momentum is hard to stop once it starts. Another factor fueling the chaos was silence. None of the involved parties immediately addressed the most extreme claims. That silence wasn't confirmation, but online, silence is rarely given the benefit of doubt. People assumed strategy, others assumed guilt, very few assumed restraint. As the conversation spread, older clips involving Tamar and Mendeecees resurfaced, moments that, in isolation, meant little but were now being reinterpreted through a suspicious lens. Tone was analyzed. Facial expressions were scrutinized. Every past interaction was treated like foreshadowing. This wasn't investigation, it was retroactive storytelling. What's important to state clearly: no verified evidence of a physical attack was presented. No reports, no footage, no statements confirming violence. The entire narrative lived in implication and repetition, but repetition is powerful. Once people hear a claim enough times, it starts to feel real, even when it isn't confirmed. That's how online chaos escalates faster than accountability can catch up. Meanwhile, Funky's role continued to be misunderstood. His intent appeared to be correction, urging viewers to question exaggerated claims and look at timelines critically. But his involvement, ironically, gave the story more oxygen. Because when a well-known commentator speaks, attention multiplies. And attention doesn't always respect context. By the end of this phase, the situation had transformed completely. What might have been a tense disagreement became a viral allegation storm, one fueled by outrage, loyalty, and speculation rather than facts. At the moment where emotions are high, language has escalated beyond evidence, and the internet is once again racing ahead of confirmation. The question now isn't what happened, it's whether the truth can even catch up to the narrative that's already taken hold. Once the word choice shifted, everything escalated. What had been described as a heated confrontation quickly transformed into something far more serious, not because new information surfaced, but because language changed. And in online culture, language is destiny. The moment phrases like jumped and attack entered the conversation, the tone hardened. Fans weren't debating disagreement anymore, they were reacting to the idea of violence. That shift pulled emotion to the front and pushed nuance to the back. And that's when the internet picked sides. Supporters of Tamar Braxton felt the framing echoed a familiar pattern, women's conflicts being minimized until they're reframed as explosive to get attention. They argued that exaggeration didn't come from Tamar, but from how others retold the story. To them, the issue wasn't whether something physical happened, it was how quickly speculation turned into accusation. On the other side, supporters of Mendeecees Harris felt the narrative was being unfairly weaponized. They pointed out that no verified evidence supported claims of violence, yet reputational damage was already happening in real time. In their view, the internet had decided guilt before facts had a chance to appear. Both sides felt justified, both sides felt protective, neither side had confirmation. That's the environment where chaos thrives. Meanwhile, Funky Dineva found himself unintentionally becoming a central figure. His commentary, originally framed around receipts of conversation and timeline inconsistencies, was now being cited as validation for claims he never actually made. Clips of his analysis circulated without disclaimers, stripped of context, and reposted with captions suggesting certainty. This is where interpretation overtakes intent. Funky emphasized caution. He urged viewers to separate heated words from physical actions, but caution doesn't travel as far as outrage. The more his name was attached to the story, the more people assumed he was confirming something, even though he never did. That misrepresentation added fuel. As the debate raged, silence from the main parties became louder than any statement could have been. No immediate lives, no written explanations, no clarifications. And once again, the absence of response was treated as evidence by some and restraint by others. Silence is a Rorschach test online. People see what they expect to see. Another escalation point came from repetition. The same unverified phrases were repeated across platforms so often that they began to feel established. Viewers encountering the story late assumed the early claims had already been verified, simply because everyone was speaking with certainty. That's how misinformation solidifies, not through lies but through confidence. The conversation also began drifting away from the original moment entirely. Instead of asking what happened, people asked why this keeps happening. Past conflicts were dragged in, old tensions resurfaced, everything became context, even when it wasn't directly related. This expansion blurred boundaries further, and once boundaries blur, accountability gets complicated. Fans who tried to slow the conversation down were often drowned out. They reminded others that words like jumped carry serious implications, that repeating violent language without evidence harms everyone involved. But those voices struggled to compete with the adrenaline of outrage. Outrage is addictive. It creates community, it creates momentum, it creates villains and heroes, but it rarely creates truth. As hours turned into days, the story reached a saturation point. No new receipts appeared, no confirmations were made, yet the narrative kept circulating, fueled by edits, reactions, and emotionally charged summaries. At this stage, the damage wasn't coming from what actually happened, it was coming from what people believed happened. That distinction matters, because belief shapes perception, and perception shapes reputation. For Tamar, the language inflation risked overshadowing her actual experience, whatever it was, by attaching claims she never made. For Mendeecees, it meant being publicly associated with allegations without evidence. And for Funky, it meant watching his commentary be repurposed beyond his control. Everyone lost something in the escalation. This phase of the story exposed a hard truth about online discourse. Once violent language enters a narrative, it rarely leaves. Even if later corrected, the initial impact lingers. The words stick, the associations remain, and correction never travels as far as accusation. By the end of Part 2, the story had fully detached from its origin. It was no longer about a moment or an exchange. It was about what people thought it represented. a symbol of disrespect to some, a symbol of exaggeration to others. But symbols don't need facts to survive, they only need belief, and belief, once widespread, becomes almost impossible to unwind. By this stage, the story wasn't being driven by events, it was being driven by impact. The emotional fallout had taken center stage, and the question shifted from what happened to who pays the price when narratives spiral out of control. For Tamar Braxton, the escalation carried a familiar weight. Tamar has long existed in a public space where her emotions are magnified, reinterpreted, and often used against her. As the language online grew harsher, fans began attaching words to her experience that she never used herself. That misalignment mattered, because it reframed her from someone reacting to a situation into someone at the center of a far more serious allegation she didn't publicly make. That kind of narrative hijacking is exhausting. When your name becomes shorthand for a story you didn't author, you lose control not just of the facts, but of how your feelings are perceived. Tamar's supporters worried that exaggeration was overshadowing whatever her real experience was, turning complexity into spectacle. On the other side, Mendeecees Harris was dealing with a different kind of pressure. Even without confirmation, association with violent language carries immediate reputational weight. Online, nuance doesn't wait. The mere repetition of certain phrases plants an image that's hard to shake regardless of later clarification. This is where reputation absorbs damage silently. You don't need proof for doubt to linger. You don't need confirmation for suspicion to spread. And once that happens, public perception begins shifting quietly, almost invisibly. Meanwhile, Funky Dineva found himself in an uncomfortable position, watching his commentary morph into something he never intended. His original focus on timelines and exaggeration had been reframed by others as validation for extreme claims. That reframing placed him at the center of a storm he was trying to de-escalate. This is the paradox of commentary culture. When you speak to correct misinformation, you often amplify it. When you urge caution, your words get clipped into certainty. Funky's name being attached to the narrative gave it credibility in the eyes of many viewers, even when his actual message was about slowing down and questioning language. Intent was lost in translation, replaced by the internet's appetite for decisive takes. Emotionally, all sides were being affected, even if none were speaking publicly. Silence doesn't mean absence of impact. It often means processing away from the spotlight because engaging would only intensify the situation. That's where self-protection comes in. Silence becomes a boundary, distance becomes a shield. And while audiences often interpret silence as strategy or guilt, it's frequently about survival, especially when the narrative has grown larger than reality. This phase also revealed how quickly online communities polarize. Supporters rallied around their chosen side, interpreting every development through loyalty. Dissenting opinions were dismissed. Complexity was flattened. The story became binary, victim versus aggressor, even though no such clarity had been established. Binary stories are easier to consume, but they're rarely accurate. As the days went on, the conversation began to fatigue, not because truth emerged, but because repetition drained energy. The same arguments cycled. The same clips circulated. And without new information, the story started losing urgency. But fatigue doesn't erase damage. By now, the association had been made. People would remember the headline language even if they forgot the disclaimers. That's how reputational harm works in the digital age. It lingers quietly, resurfacing whenever names are mentioned together again. This is the part people rarely see, the quiet recalibration, the guarded future interactions, the increased caution with words, appearances, and engagement. Public figures don't emerge from these moments unchanged. They adapt, they share less. They trust fewer platforms. They think twice before speaking, not because they're guilty, but because they've seen how quickly meaning can be distorted. For audiences, this phase offered a sobering lesson: language matters. Violent phrasing carries consequences even when used casually. Repeating unverified claims doesn't just spread information, it spreads impact. And impact doesn't ask whether intent was malicious. As this chapter progressed, some fans began acknowledging that the situation had gone too far, that words had outpaced evidence, that speculation had eclipsed caution. Those voices didn't dominate the conversation, but they signaled a shift, a recognition that the story had become bigger than anyone involved. And that realization sets the stage for what comes next, not resolution, but reflection. A moment where the internet pauses just long enough to reconsider how quickly it escalates conflict without confirmation. By the time the dust finally settled, one thing became impossible to ignore. This story was never really about what happened. It was about how fast the internet decided what must have happened. And once that decision was made, everything else followed. This final phase wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it was quiet and heavy. For Tamar Braxton, the moment underscored a painful pattern. When Tamar reacts emotionally, the internet often fills in the blanks for her, attaching language, intent, and severity she never publicly claimed. As the narrative escalated, her experience was no longer hers. It was repackaged, amplified, and reshaped into something far more extreme than what she herself described. That loss of narrative control hurts, not because attention is overwhelming, but because misrepresentation is. Tamar didn't ask for violent language to define the moment. Yet once it entered the conversation, it clung to her name whether she agreed with it or not. For Mendeecees Harris, the aftermath was about association. Even without evidence, being linked to claims of physical confrontation leaves residue. Online, clarification rarely outruns accusation. The first version of a story sticks, especially when it's dramatic. And drama doesn't need proof to survive, it only needs repetition. For Funky Dineva, this chapter became a cautionary tale about commentary itself. His intention appeared to be de-escalation, to question exaggeration and slow down reckless language. But once his analysis entered the algorithm, it was clipped, reframed, and used to validate positions he never stated outright. That's the paradox of influence. The louder your voice, the less control you have over how it's used. As the days passed, the conversation lost momentum, not because clarity arrived, but because attention moved on. Another headline replaced this one. Another debate took its place. That's how the cycle works. But what lingers isn't the headline, it's the impression. People will remember that situation. They'll remember the phrasing. They'll remember how it felt, even if they forget what was actually said. And that's the most dangerous part of all. Because feelings feel like facts when repeated often enough. This chapter forces a larger reflection, not just on the people involved, but on the audience watching. On how quickly we escalate language. On how casually we repeat serious claims. On how little space we leave for uncertainty before choosing sides. The internet rewards speed, truth requires patience. Those two rarely coexist. None of the parties rush to deliver a dramatic resolution. No apology videos, no confrontational lives, no receipts dropped to end it all. And that frustrated many viewers because we've been conditioned to expect closure. But real life doesn't always offer it. Sometimes the healthiest outcome isn't resolution, it's distance. Pulling back, letting the noise burn itself out instead of feeding it, choosing not to perform pain or defense for public consumption. That choice doesn't trend, but it protects. As this story fades, what remains is perspective. Perspective on how rumors grow legs, on how violent language can attach itself to situations that don't warrant it, and on how easily commentary can cross into harm, even when intentions aren't malicious. This wasn't a story about proof being shown. It was a story about how quickly stories are written without proof, and that's where it ends. Not with exposure, not with vindication, but with awareness. Awareness that every share matters, every word carries weight, and every escalation leaves someone carrying consequences long after the internet scrolls on. Now I want to hear from you. After seeing how this situation escalated, do you think the internet crossed the line by using violent language without confirmation? Should commentators and fans slow down before repeating claims that can damage reputations? Or is that just the cost of being in the public eye? And when narratives spiral this fast, is silence a smart form of self-protection, or does it only invite more speculation? Drop your thoughts in the comments respectfully, because conversations like this matter more than clicks. If you appreciate breakdowns that focus on context, caution, and accountability instead of reckless rumors, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Whenever stories heat up and facts get blurry, we'll be right here breaking it all down clearly and responsibly.